What if there was a medication that required only one dose to create lasting changes in mental health, improving outlook on death, easing PTSD, and even enhancing connection to the world? What if I told you that these substances have been used for thousands of years as so-called spirit medicines in cultures all over the world? These drugs, more commonly referred to as psychedelics, have a long and fascinating history, not only as tools for individual healing, but also for strengthening community bonds and deepening connections to nature. In 1960s, psychedelics surged into popularity, only to be quickly pushed back into illegality and stigma. However, after decades of prohibition, the West is becoming more open to psychedelics, with increasing research exploring their potential benefits. This is Health Reframed, where we take an in-depth look at medical and scientific ideas, breaking them down into high-quality, accurate, and understandable information. I'm Jack Snyder. With a degree in biomedical sciences, a concentration in anatomy and physiology, and 4 years as an EMT, I bring insights from both research and real-world healthcare perspectives. Today, we're exploring psychedelics, their long history, how they work in the brain, and their emerging role in mental health. If that all sounds interesting, stick around. This is one episode you won't want to miss. To truly understand the modern conversation around psychedelics, we need to look back, way back. Psychedelic substances have been woven into human history for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Their use spans cultures, continents, and belief systems, often playing a vital role in the spiritual and communal practices of the time. By setting the stage with this historical perspective and context, I think we can better understand how psychedelics went from sacred tools to stigmatized substances. The word psychedelic, now used to describe certain psychoactive substances, is relatively new. It was coined in 1957 by Humphrey Osmond while he was writing to Aldous Huxley. It comes from the Greek words psyche, meaning mind or soul, and delion, which means to manifest, making the word literally mean to manifest the soul or to manifest the mind. Though the word we now use for these drugs is new, their usage across time is far from it. Psychedelics have been thought to have been used for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, like I said. One of the earliest known psychedelics is peyote, a cactus containing mescaline, which has been central to Native American spiritual traditions for thousands of years. The Native American church uses this cactus in a ritual performed by a shaman or spiritual guide. The shaman guides the person who has taken the drug through personal sufferings and crisis in a ritual that lasts all night long. Some evidence even suggests that the ritual use of peyote may date back tens of thousands of years, with its role in spiritual healing still central to Native American church today. Similarly, the Aztecs prepared a psychoactive drug from the seeds of the morning glory flower. In doing so, they created a preparation very similar to the modern psychedelic LSD. They also used psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and their name for it was actually God's flesh. Indigenous groups in South America have used psychedelics, particularly ayahuasca, for thousands of years. The earliest depictions of its use date back to 900 BC, and it remains an integral part of spiritual and healing traditions. Its use has long been tied to cultural and religious uses. Furthermore, many indigenous groups in South America have a very different view of psychedelics than the prevailing Western view, which I think can help us give insights into its original uses and how it can be used today. Unlike the modern clinical settings, ayahuasca and the ritual around it is firmly grounded in religious, communal, and developmental spheres. In preparation for the ayahuasca experience, the shaman would spend days or even weeks with the person, preparing them, learning about their life, and coming to a full understanding so that they can effectively guide the person during their trip. In this way, the shaman acts as much more than just a pharmacist handing out a drug. They're deeply invested in the person and interested in seeing their growth from the trip. Even the preparation of the drug is an involved process. Ayahuasca is prepared from the bark of a woody vine in the forest. This bark is then heated and mixed with a variety of other plants to create the psychoactive drink. The ritual around the trip is viewed as a religious experience, giving the person a view of the real reality. See, the reality we experience in our day-to-day is a mere illusion in this way of thinking. And the experience not only serves to grow the individual, but it also helps them address their past and strengthen their bonds with the divine, nature, and the community as a whole. Such ceremonies and uses of psychedelics were very commonplace all over the world. Some African cultures would cut open their scalp and rub in the juice of the kwashi plant, believed to induce visions and spiritual insight. In Siberia, they used the fly agaric mushroom, also called Amanita muscaria, and it was consumed mixed with reindeer milk and wild blueberries. This mushroom, with its bright red cap and white spots, remains a symbol of shamanic traditions all over the world and in this region specifically. Even ancient Europeans in Greece and Rome ingested a psychedelic drink. Initiates of the Eleusinian Mysteries, a secretive religious rite, consumed kykeon, a psychedelic drink possibly containing ergot. That's a fungus with compounds very similar to LSD inside of it. These are just a few examples of the ancient traditions around psychedelic compounds. There are many more, but I think this gives us a good idea of how wide-reaching they are. For most of human history, psychedelics were indeed viewed as tools for sacred healing, spiritual growth, and community bonding. The real anomaly isn't that they're being used, it's how they became stigmatized, criminalized, and dismissed in such a short span of time. How did we go from reverence to rejection? The modern history of psychedelics really begins to take shape with a man called Albert Hofmann. Hofmann was a Swiss chemist who, upon receiving a doctorate in medicinal chemistry, began working in a lab synthesizing compounds in medicinal plants. In this lab, he synthesized LSD. At the time, however, he hadn't realized just what he had found. He actually tabled the LSD for 5 whole years until one day in April in 1943, he had accidentally absorbed a small amount of LSD through his skin, which in turn caused him to experience hallucinations and visual effects, and in other words, the first LSD trip ever. And it was indeed an accident. In the coming years, he began to use the drug more often, coming to an understanding of it and believing that it could have potential benefits for schizophrenic and other psychiatric patients. However, as time went on, Hofmann's drug became one characterized less by its potential use for medicine and more by its recreational use during the 60s, a use that Hofmann himself disliked. The 60s were a most radical decade of change, and naturally, with any change comes the fear of change. As much as psychedelics were used during this time, many saw the drug use in a much poorer light. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970, passed by President Nixon, classified psychedelics, among other drugs like marijuana and even heroin, as drugs that have no medical use, are harmful, and present a high capacity for abuse and addiction. However, we know now, and we even knew to a great extent then, that psychedelics don't really pose much danger in terms of toxicity and have not shown to be very addictive. So this raises the natural question, why were they banned in the first place? Many factors play into this question, and there's not one simple answer, I'm afraid, but some of the factors were a couple public bad trips that made the news and really changed public perception of the drugs, the effects of the war on drugs, attacking all of the drugs, including psychedelics, professional biases, and a long built-in anti-drug moral milieu. This likely originated from a Puritan sentiment of drugs and a stigmatization that they implemented in the culture with drugs. Furthermore, the Controlled Substances Act made it extremely difficult for any research to be done on psychedelic drugs, thus making it harder to make a definitive case for or against their reclassification. However, in recent years, there has been something of a renaissance of not only psychedelic use, but research as well. There's a growing literature that paints psychedelics in a hopeful light as a powerful intervention for psychiatric and mental health conditions. The modern history is complicated, but we seem to be entering into an era that Hofmann, the creator of LSD, would have been pleased with. In 2006, research into psychedelic effects on mental and spiritual health brought the idea of research back into the mainstream. In 2016, another landmark study showed how mushrooms could help with existential anxiety. And in 2021, the first federal grant was issued for psychedelic research. This was the first grant for such a thing in over 50 years. One thing is clear, psychedelics present an exciting area of research and promise, but before we can see how scientists have used psychedelics in a clinical setting, Let's take a further look into how they have been and are being used in retreat-like settings and in traditional therapeutic spiritual settings. Psychedelic retreats have become increasingly popular as a means of exploring and healing the mind, body, and spirit. These retreats often center around the use of substances like ayahuasca, psilocybin, and other psychedelics, facilitating powerful transformative experiences. The rituals at these retreats are steeped in both ancient traditions and modern therapeutic practices, creating a blend of spiritual and clinical experiences that aim to guide participants toward a deeper self-understanding, healing, and connection with the world around them. At the heart of many psychedelic retreats, particularly those that work with ayahuasca, is a ceremonial structure that has been practiced by indigenous communities in the Amazon for centuries. The ceremonies are typically led by shamans or facilitators who guide the participants through the experience with prayers, chants, and rituals that are intended to create a safe and supportive environment. These rituals are believed to help open the mind to insights, healing, and connection with the spiritual realms. Often, participants will engage in preparatory practices such as fasting, setting intentions for the trip, and engaging in group discussions before and after the ceremony. This helps focus their mind and intentions for the experience. In contrast, retreats that focus on substances like psilocybin or LSD may incorporate more modern therapeutic frameworks, including integration sessions, group therapy, and guided meditations. These retreats often draw from psychological and medical research on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, with an emphasis on creating a supportive environment that prioritizes safety and well-being. These facilitators, who may include psychologists, therapists, or experienced guides, often use a combination of techniques such as breathwork, guided visualization, and cognitive processing to help participants navigate their experiences. Integration sessions are a key component of these retreats. This is where participants reflect on their journeys, process the emotional and psychological insights, as well as receive guidance on how to apply these revelations to their everyday lives. Importantly, the success of these retreats is often deeply tied to set and setting, which many of you may have heard of. This is a term used to describe the mindset of the participant and the actual environment in which the experience occurs. A safe, well-prepared setting can contribute to a positive therapeutic experience, whereas a stressful and chaotic environment can lead to anxiety and negative reactions. This is why many psychedelic retreats emphasize creating an environment of comfort, safety, and respect, where participants are able to really let go and surrender to the experience and let it give them what it has to offer. While the rituals and therapeutic frameworks may vary across different types of psychedelic retreats, one common thread is the emphasis on community and connection. Many participants report feeling a deep sense of belonging and interconnectedness with the others in their retreat experience. This communal aspect, often encouraged through group sharing, ceremonies, and support networks, can help individuals process their experiences more deeply and foster a sense of emotional healing. Despite the growing popularity of these retreats, it is important to approach them with some caution and care. The potential benefits are significant, but the risk of challenging or difficult experiences is also present. As psychedelic therapy becomes more mainstream, it's crucial that these retreats are held to very high standards in terms of safety, professionalism, and ethical practice, thus ensuring the participants are well informed and supported throughout the entire process and throughout the entire journey. But now that we've discussed all of the history and exactly how these drugs have been used and how they're currently being used, what are these drugs? How do they work? Though there are many, many different kinds of psychedelics, there are really only a few being studied for medical use at the moment. Some of the main ones are psilocybin, which is the chemical in magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, MDMA, and ketamine. Though some of them work in similar ways, some do not. So let's break down each one of these one by one and see what they do to the brain and the body. Starting with psilocybin, which again is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, we must first discuss the default mode network of the brain. If you've listened to the episode on meditation, we talked about this there as well. This network, abbreviated the DMN, consists of multiple areas in the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher order function and reasoning, the hippocampus, which is related to memory, and the amygdala, which is an important area of the brain for processing emotions. The DMN has found to be highly active during resting and rumination and when you are not involved in any tasks. These regions are known to be more active when you're self-blaming as well. These are some of the common symptoms of depression. It is still unclear how psilocybin affects the default mode network, but some research suggests that psilocybin reduces DMN activity, leading to a loosening of rigid thought patterns, while others propose a more complex reorganization rather than a simple increase or decrease. The main idea here is that the default mode network is active when you're ruminating or self-blaming. These are processes and things that happen when you're depressed. And because psilocybin seems to have an effect on depression, it's thought that it affects this network as well. Even though we're not entirely sure how it does, that's why we think it does. Besides the DMN, it is a common observation that psilocybin increases connectivity in the brain and even shifts how you think from a top-down model to a bottom-up one. In top-down processing, you have your beliefs, and your beliefs influence how you think and how you perceive the world, hence the top-down. Bottom-up processing is the reverse. Instead of having your beliefs influence what you think and perceive about the world, the actual inputs from the world influence how you think and perceive the world. So instead of your beliefs influencing it, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, these are the things that are influencing what you think. This hypothesis is called the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, and it claims that by breaking the usual thought patterns and allowing for more connections to occur in the brain, one can often achieve a brighter perspective on the world. Another similar hypothesis is called the entropic brain hypothesis. Entropy is a measure of disorder in a system, where high entropy means disorder. Let's say you have a bottle and you mix oil and water in it. If you shake it up, you increase the entropy, you increase the disorder in the system being the bottle, and the water and the oil are all mixed together, but they don't like being together, they want to separate. So they try to go to the lowest amount of disorder. And they do this by separating, making the two layers, and it's a lot more ordered this way, so entropy has gone down, at least in that small system. The hypothesis holds that psychedelics cause the brain to enter into a higher state of entropy. And in the context of the brain, this would mean that instead of having a small amount of configurations or ways that your brain can connect, that number goes way up. You can increase the number of combinations and connections that can form in your brain. And technically, according to entropy, this would be more disordered. But it actually turns out that all these connections and all these combinations allow you to expand how you think and be a lot more open. And this hypothesis also holds that the default mode network that we talked about earlier collapses while on the drug. In other words, more possibilities in your brain, more connections, and less rumination. These are the ways that a lot of neuroscientists today think that the psychedelics elicit their effects. These hypotheses also point to an explanation of the ego death that many experience on these drugs. The ego death is characterized by a dissolution of one's sense of self, identity, and boundaries to the external world. When you have an ego death, it can elicit a sense of connectedness with the world, deep peace, as well as fear, depending on the context. This experience, while sometimes unsettling, is thought to play an important role in the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics by disrupting negative self-perceptions, as well as allowing for emotional processing. Furthermore, when you experience an ego death, this can allow you to have a bit of a bird's-eye view of yourself. When you dissolve your sense of self and identity, you might be able to have a better vantage point and be able to take a closer and more neutral look at who you are and your place in the world. But how does psilocybin work on a chemical and cellular basis? To begin, psilocybin is broken down in the body to its active form psilocin, which is remarkably similar to DMT, as well as the neurotransmitter serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter in the brain. Neurotransmitters are released by neurons to communicate with other neurons. Serotonin specifically is associated with pleasant mood and other mood regulations, as well as just a feeling of contentness. antidepressive medications generally work on serotonin to increase the serotonin. The thinking is if you have more serotonin, your mood is improved. This similarity between psilocybin and serotonin is thought to explain many of the effects that psilocin has in the brain. Psilocin binds to multiple serotonin receptors. You have a neuron releasing serotonin, and then the other neuron has a receptor which receives the serotonin, and that receptor, upon receiving the serotonin, elicits an effect. And when psilocin binds, it mimics serotonin, which makes it a serotonin receptor agonist. Agonist meaning that it mimics or is similar to the compound that is natural in the body, in this case being serotonin. And the receptors that it influences are particularly the 5-HT class of serotonin receptors in the brain. However, there are many different 5-HT receptors. There's 5-HT1, 5-HT2, and then there's subclasses 5-HT1A, 5-HT1B, and so on. And different ones have different or even opposing effects. For instance, binding to a 5-HT1 receptor may oppose the effect of binding to a 5-HT2 receptor, which could result in no net effect. Because of this, researchers are still unsure as to just what psilocin actually does on a broad scale, generally speaking, in these areas. The increase in activity that has been observed could explain the flooding of senses and altered perception. However, the inhibition that psilocin causes could also counter some of these effects. Beyond the cortex, the hippocampus is another area of importance, especially with regards to depression. It has been shown that the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus show marked decreases in size with depression. In other words, they shrink when you're depressed. It is thought that psilocybin affects the hippocampus when treating depression, given how important it is for depression. It has been found in mice that low-dose psilocybin increases neurogenesis, or the growth of brain tissue, in the hippocampus. Furthermore, it has been found that low-dose psilocybin causes a 10-fold increase in spine density and size of the medial prefrontal cortex. These changes may explain some of the antidepressant effects that psilocybin has. Finally, psychedelics like psilocybin have been shown to reduce depression symptoms by normalizing serotonin receptor density in certain areas of the brain. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but let me try to explain. As we said earlier, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that plays a large part in regulating upbeat and positive mood states. And you need the receptors for the serotonin to work. You can release all the serotonin you want, but if there's no receptor to receive it, it won't have any effect. It is thought that people who have major depressive disorder may have problems with serotonin and the receptors, hence why we have the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, to treat depression. However, if these drugs can help normalize the amount of serotonin receptors, this may bring the serotonin system back into balance in people with depression. The findings show that psilocybin can help normalize the amount of serotonin receptors in the medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, at least for a few days. This change, though short, can give a window to process emotions and develop a more optimistic perspective, both of which are found to last longer than the transient increase in the receptors. On to DMT. DMT works in a very similar fashion as psilocybin. Much of the research I found used them in both descriptions of the actual mechanisms of how these drugs work. DMT stands for N,N-dimethyltryptamine, and it is a compound that is found in ayahuasca. Like psilocybin, it is a strong agonist of serotonin receptors, so it mimics serotonin and binds to the serotonin receptors in the brain. Also like psilocybin, DMT elicits many of its effects from the 5-HT class of serotonin receptors. There's a great deal of speculation that DMT is naturally present in the body as well. Some researchers hypothesize that DMT is naturally produced in the brain, particularly in the pineal gland, though direct evidence remains limited. Researchers also speculate that DMT might be associated with dreams and has been associated with near-death experiences and visions that people have in those experiences. LSD, the drug we talked about first today with Dr. Hoffman, is another psychedelic that acts on serotonin receptors. Like psilocybin, it is an agonist on these receptors, so it binds to the serotonin receptors. LSD stands for lysergic acid diethylamide, and it was synthesized by Hoffman. Studies have found that LSD binds to serotonin receptors in the cortex of the brain. This likely causes the hallucinogenic effects that it elicits. LSD has also been studied to increase gene expression due to its binding in the serotonin receptors. It's thought that LSD binds to certain serotonin receptors, and this increases gene expression in those neurons. There's also some limited evidence that LSD interacts with the dopamine systems of the brain, increasing the amount of dopamine released. This interaction between the dopamine and serotonin systems in the brain likely explains some of why LSD has such a wide range of effects that it can produce. It can be very different for different people, and different LSD trips that one person have had can be very different. Unlike the classic psychedelics that we just discussed, like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT, which primarily affect serotonin receptors, MDMA and ketamine work through different mechanisms, leading to distinct effects and therapeutic potential. MDMA, or N-methyl-3,4-methylene-dioxyamphetamine, is also commonly known as ecstasy. MDMA, as the name suggests, is related to the class of drugs known as amphetamines. Whereas amphetamines cause the release of dopamine and noradrenaline, giving the elevated energetic upper response, if you will, MDMA causes the release of mainly serotonin. And by cause release of, I mean it doesn't mimic the serotonin directly, but it causes more serotonin to be released. Furthermore, MDMA also blocks serotonin reuptake into neurons, and this is similar to SSRIs. The neuron will release serotonin, it'll bind to the receptor on the other neuron, and then it will be broken down and brought back into the first neuron. MDMA slows this process down, which results in a net increase in serotonin that is in between the neurons and binding to the second neuron on the receptors. MDMA also causes the release of dopamine and noradrenaline, which do indeed elicit physical effects, but the psychedelic effects are mostly elicited by the serotonin. Our next and final drug is ketamine. Ketamine has a long history. It's been used as a safe anesthetic and also a drug that reduces pain, often in operating rooms as well as in the field on ambulances. As well as the other drugs we've talked about, ketamine does indeed cause the release of serotonin, as well as dopamine and norepinephrine. However, ketamine also blocks what are called NMDA receptors in the brain. These receptors bind to the neurotransmitter glutamate, which is one of the most widespread and prevalent neurotransmitters in the nerve system. Half of the cells in the nervous system have these receptors. They're all over the place. Furthermore, ketamine also acts on the cholinergic and opioid systems, and these have excitatory and inhibitory functions. The opioid systems, as the name suggests, are related to opioids. These are the receptors that opioids or painkillers act on. But the exact mechanisms of why ketamine causes a psychoactive experience are still unknown, but it likely has something to do with its effects on serotonin, as well as the fact that it just has very, very widespread effects in the nervous system as a whole. Though there are many, many more psychedelics that we could talk about, these do appear to be the main ones being studied today. Furthermore, of this group, it appears that psilocybin and LSD are the main ones of even this group that are being looked at. So, what have we found in terms of how well these drugs work for mental health and depression and anxiety and everything else? So, research on psychedelics began again in the 90s after the initial prohibition, and one of the first papers on the topic was published in 1994 by Starsman and Qualls. They observed how different doses of DMT affect people. They found that there was a dose-response relationship for DMT. In other words, they collected data so that they could see what effects a range of doses did. So low doses have a low effect, and higher doses have a stronger effect, is what they found. A keynote of the study is that they found DMT can be safely administered. This is an important finding, given that DMT is a Schedule I drug, and if we remember, Schedule I drugs, part of the classification is that they are unsafe. Further smaller trials help to cement the safety profile of psychedelic drugs. Today, institutions such as Johns Hopkins, the American Psychological Association, and Duke School of Medicine probe the topic of research with a hopeful attitude. So, where's the current state of affairs with psychedelics on the research side of things today? Since the 90s, there have been a number of studies and clinical trials conducted with psychedelics. A meta-analysis by Rucker and colleagues found that psychedelics, like psilocybin and LSD, led to improvements for patients with major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder. In this analysis, they found that 79% of the patients across the studies they looked at improved, according to clinician judgment. 79%, that's quite a lot. That's a supermajority of the patients in all of these studies they looked at. Another landmark study in the field of psychedelics came out in 2016. This was a double-blind, randomized clinical trial. In this kind of trial, neither the participants nor the researchers know who is getting the actual drug, psilocybin in this case, or the placebo, which is just a fake pill that doesn't have any drug in it. Griffiths and colleagues compared how a low placebo-like dose and a high dose of psilocybin impacted 51 patients with life-threatening cancer diagnoses. They were interested in how psilocybin affected the anxiety and depression that came along with having such a end-of-life and terminal diagnosis. Their findings were nothing short of astonishing, given the gold standard design of the study, and they really sent ripples through society in terms of really having to reconsider what psychedelics might be capable of. They found that the patients had substantial and sustained decreases in depression and anxiety, not only 5 weeks after, but 6 months after the trip. Over 80% of the participants stated that they had moderate or great increases in well-being and life satisfaction, some of them reporting that the experience was one of the most profound of their life. Similar studies have found similar results, further buttressing psilocybin's potential for treating depression and anxiety. Psilocybin also shows promise for substance abuse. A study conducted in 2014 explored how psilocybin impacted smoking and smoking cessation. Johnson and colleagues found that after 6 months, 80% of participants had not smoked in the past 7 days. So they asked them, have you smoked in the past 7 days, 6 months after they took the drug? And 80% of them said no. Other forms of medication and therapy used for smoking cessation generally show about a 35% success rate on the same metric. So this is a big increase from that. A similar study investigated the effects of psychedelics on alcohol. They found that abstinence increased significantly following psilocybin administration and that the gains were maintained when they checked in 9 months later. One of the ways it is thought that these drugs elicit these effects is by resetting the connections of the brain. This allows for novel insights and emotional release to occur. If true, this could prove immensely useful in treating a wide range of psychiatric conditions. Finally, I want to discuss a phase 3 clinical trial that looked at using MDMA to treat moderate to severe PTSD. Published in 2023, the study found that MDMA-assisted therapy reduced PTSD symptoms and functional impairment. This and one other study prompted a proposition to the FDA to approve MDMA treatment for PTSD. However, MDMA was not approved by the FDA. They found that these 2 studies were insufficient to approve it for this use, but this is a big step. This proposition made headline news, and even though it wasn't approved, I think it's a necessary step towards psychedelics being used in these sort of clinical settings for things like PTSD, depression, and anxiety. However, this does segue us well into the drawbacks of the current research as it stands. Psychedelics are once again being researched, and this is great, and the findings seem to point to impressive utility of these drugs for well-being, substance abuse, PTSD, and depression and anxiety. However, there are some flaws in these studies that are of note. Perhaps the most pertinent one is small sample size. When it comes to research, it's important that the amount of people involved in the study is large enough to be representative of the whole population. Otherwise, it's hard to say that the drug works for all people the way that it did for those in the study. Many of these studies have very insufficient sample sizes. The 2 I mentioned about smoking and alcohol only had 10 participants each. This is far too small to make any sweeping generalizations. Another issue with these studies is that it is almost impossible for the participants to be properly blinded. As I mentioned before, a double-blind study is where the participant and the researcher don't know who is getting the drug or the placebo. However, with psychedelics, this gold standard is a little tricky because the nature of the drugs and the effects they elicit, visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, euphoria, those make it really difficult to make sure that the participants don't know which group they're in, because it becomes very clear very quickly to the participants and likely the researchers who is in each group. Finally, the studies rely on subjective reports from research and participants. The data from such reports is very useful, but it's generally not seen as robust as something as more objective and measurable data. While the therapeutic potential of psychedelics is very promising, it's also equally important to acknowledge the risks associated with their use. Adverse psychological reactions, such as anxiety, paranoia, and the so-called bad trips, can be very distressing, particularly in uncontrolled settings or for individuals with underlying mental health conditions. There's also a risk for hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, and in rare cases, the triggering of psychotic episodes, especially in those predisposed to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD, is where the effects of the drug, the hallucinations, persist long after the drug should have worn off. And with those who are predisposed to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, extreme caution should be taken with these drugs as they can trigger psychotic episodes. Physiologically, substances like MDMA carry additional risks, including serotonin syndrome and cardiovascular strain at high doses. The importance of set and setting, a person's mindset and environment during the trip, really can't be overstated, as these factors play a critical role in shaping the experiences and outcomes. A proper set and setting can help reduce the anxiety, paranoia, and bad trips that we discussed earlier. Additionally, concerns around commercialization and the lack of long-term studies on frequent use raise ethical and practical considerations. As psychedelics move towards broader acceptance, ensuring responsible use through education, harm reduction strategies, and proper integration practices will be essential. Because of these drawbacks to the current literature, we are not able at the current time to make any sweeping generalizations, at least from the perspective of clinical research. However, in my opinion, what these trials are beginning to suggest is an affirmation of what the world has known about psychedelics for thousands of years and their transformative potential. This sentiment is one that is beginning to be held by major institutions as well. An article on Harvard's website states that it is incredibly exciting to see what the future of psychedelic therapy holds. Such a time-tested legacy must hold some salt, after all. These factors all indicate that we need to have a mature and nuanced discussion about psychedelics. We need to seriously consider what the research tells us, as it can help shed light on how the drugs work and what kinds of things we can expect from them. However, as psychedelic research progresses, we must integrate the scientific findings with an appreciation of their historical and cultural significance and how they have been used. The conversation around psychedelics cannot be confined to clinical settings alone. It must also consider the broader human experience, including meaning, spirituality, and self-discovery. How then should we approach this discussion as a society? I think one of the most pertinent aspects of the discussion and question of how should psychedelics be used is the long history of how they've been used. I've harped a lot on history in this one because I think it's very important. We've already discussed some of the broad histories of where psychedelics have been used and for how long, but I think continuing this discussion, giving more examples, and by looking at more of the specifics of how they were used could give insight into how we may go about using them today. As I've already mentioned, psychedelics have been used across the world for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Their usage was often integral to the society, being utilized when problems plagued the group or when an individual needed spiritual or emotional guidance. Furthermore, psychedelics have a history of being used in initiation or coming-of-age ceremonies, rituals aimed at bringing the initiate closer with the spirit world or the divine. In Africa, the cult of Gabon used Ibigato to enter into the world of the dead in a rite that could last for days. Similarly, the Bantu used the dream route to communicate with their ancestors. Australian Aboriginals used a hallucinogen to induce dreams and visions, once again communicating with the supernatural realm. Ancient cultures in Siberia used Amanita muscaria, the red and white fairy tale mushroom, to allow the shaman to be exalted and commune with the past's ancestors. In China, they have a book, a very ancient book on drugs. This is their oldest book on drugs, actually. And it has a section in there about cannabis, which states that cannabis could allow one to communicate with the spirits. Even in the Holy Land, psychedelic use has been confirmed. In 2022, research showed that a shrine in Jerusalem contained charred remains of several cannabinoids, hinting at their use in mystical traditions. In the Americas, psychedelics were used by native peoples to see beyond surface appearances into the true nature of things, into the other world. They also used psychedelics to communicate with the dead. There seems to be a very common thread here. Ancient civilizations used psychedelics to become in touch with a supernatural reality, a reality that allowed one to speak with ancestors, see visions, and glimpse the true nature of the universe. I also found that many of these traditions used music during their rituals. The questions that these drugs may provide answers for are broad, encompassing not just a personal sense of meaning, but also a greater understanding of our connectedness with each other, nature, and the divine. So, this is probably a good time to bring up a rather important point about psychedelics. They have long been used in mystical and spiritual rites, things that Western society, in many ways, has long moved past. We have all but replaced the religious traditions of old with the rational and scientific sensibilities of new. Hearing about communicating with the dead and seeing spirits, communing with spirits, sounds rather jarring to the Western mind. I think to understand the ancient view on psychedelics, we need to bridge this gap and come to an understanding of these traditions. In most of these traditional cultures, we don't have that sense of division between what is human and the natural world. We believe we are always interacting with living, responsive consciousness all around us. And when we use spirit medicines, we're looking for communication and to restore balance with that world. So the context is never individual well-being or mental health, but the collective well-being of the environment as a whole. This is what Uriah Celedwin, a senior academic at the University of California, Berkeley, has to say about the matter. She also says that indigenous use isn't only about rituals and ceremonies, but everyday practices. For example, if something of value has been lost, the community would go to the medicine practitioner. I think this sentiment brings an important aspect of psychedelic use to light. Can they even be used beneficially without the spiritual and mystical elements being present? I think this is a fair question because it seems like the benefits and the reason that society has used them for so long is in large part due to the benefits accrued to the society at large and the connection they bring to the culture, as well as the mystical and spiritual sides of the drugs. Because of this, I think that the future of psychedelics needs to be aware of this historical background. That viewing these drugs like other pharmaceuticals may very well be folly. Celedwin says it well. It's not the molecule itself. It's the larger constellation of relationships that are created that brings healing. She also warns that although we may see benefit after exposure to these medicines initially, the benefit may not be maintained because it is not grounded in a collective context. Elucidating the mechanisms behind these drugs is of great utility, don't get me wrong, and I think that combining these findings with what society has explored for thousands of years only makes sense. To use psychedelics properly necessarily calls for not only a renaissance of the drugs themselves and their use, but also the mindsets required for their use. This kind of renaissance would necessitate an openness to the idea that reality can in fact be expanded, that our awareness and perception can be shifted such that we can experience things that are outside of our grasp normally. After Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, Western society increasingly distanced itself from spirituality and mysticism. At the same time, in the areas where spirituality and religion persisted, puritanical influences contributed to the stigmatization of psychedelics and drugs, particularly within the religious circles. The rational materialist perspective, which reduces all experiences to physics and chemistry, really leaves no room for the mystical or transcendent interpretations of the world. Additionally, puritanical attitudes played a key role in fueling the war on drugs and the criminalization of psychedelics, leaving no room for these drugs in the religious milieu of the West. As a result, the spiritual dimension of these substances has been caught between a rock and a hard place. On one side, the reductionist skepticism of modern science, and on the other, the moral condemnation from religious institutions. That said, I do believe that the mere use of psychedelics is opening this conversation a lot more. After all, to ingest psychedelics and experience the altered perception is in many ways to have the mystical experience of old. What I'm proposing is that as we continue to investigate these substances from a scientific and rationalistic perspective, we also allow ourselves to be open to the mystical and spiritual perspective that seems so necessary when discussing and using these drugs. I think another way of viewing this is considering the scientific findings of psychedelics. Take the study we mentioned earlier with terminally ill cancer patients. The single dose of psilocybin acted not necessarily to reverse faulty bodily processes or replace a deficient chemical, but it acted to radically shift the mindset and outlook of the participants involved. This kind of mindset shift, or frame shift, is something that really can't be reduced to a mere chemical reaction. It comprises the whole self and sense of being that a person encapsulates. It deals with meaning, things that are really outside of just the purely physical. It gets into the area of what it means to be human and what we are. I think considering this point of view helps show that psychedelics are really unlike the pharmaceutical drugs that we normally compare them to. And the things that they deal with are things that are more broad and outside of the realm of the purely physical in many ways. That said, this broader perspective on psychedelics is becoming more mainstream, I believe. Not everyone falls neatly into the camps of rational materialism or outright prohibition, after all. Scientific research has played a crucial role in shifting public perception, demonstrating the profound therapeutic potential of these substances. By integrating these findings with the deep historical and cultural traditions surrounding psychedelics, as well as considering the mystical and spiritual aspects, I think we can chart a path forward, a truly innovative path forward, one that honors what has worked for millennia, while embracing the new discoveries and the new innovations that we're pursuing today. Today, we took a deep dive into psychedelics. Their history is long and rich, a history that can help us figure out where psychedelics can play a role in our Western society today. Understanding how they have been used for thousands of years as medicines that not only improve the individual, but improve the connectedness of the culture with itself and nature is vital to understanding their place in the world. Furthermore, psychedelics have been a growing area of interest in the world of scientific research. More and more studies are being conducted every day to investigate psychedelics' effects on anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and more. These findings are incredibly promising, but we will need more data and raw numbers before the legal and medical landscape really starts to change. Regardless, I'm hopeful for the future of psychedelics in the scientific world, and really can't wait to see what the research continues to come out with. The ancient use and modern use of psychedelics approach these drugs from two different angles. Although they may seem contradictory in many ways, I think that by alchemizing them together, we can form a really new and holistic understanding of psychedelics that combines the ancient traditions and the new science, that we can use these and transform the mental health landscape and perhaps even society in many ways. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, make sure to share it and follow the podcast. It helps out a lot. I hope you all have a good one. Peace out.